Okay, it is time. Let's go ahead and get started tonight. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. This is our 6th reading from Wuthering Heights. The last time we really started to see, as things were accelerating and moving toward the conclusion, we're getting closer and closer to the present day in Nellie's retelling of the story of everyone there at Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and how they've become the people they are that we saw in the introduction. They're, in general, not the greatest of people across the board. Even the ones that seem to have been more put upon than others are falling into their own little circle of abuse and just general bad character. But we'll see if there's any sort of repentance or regrets as we get on toward the end. We'll see if, as they get to the present day, when everything really finishes to fall apart, that whether there will be any sort of redeeming characteristics that we find, or if this is all there is. Sometimes it's all sad anyway. Yeah, intense bastardry. That is a very good way to put it. So, let's go ahead and jump back into it tonight. We are beginning with chapter 27. This one is, so we're about 3/4 of the way through the book. So we'll be able to get through a fair chunk tonight, probably finishing up tomorrow. So, here we are with chapter 27. 7 days glided away, every one marking its course by the henceforth rapid alteration of Edgar Linton's state. The havoc that months had previously wrought was now emulated by the inroads of hours. Catherine we would fain have deluded yet, but her own quick spirit refused to delude her. It divined in secret, and brooded on the dreadful probability, gradually ripening into certainty. She had not the heart to mention her ride, when Thursday came round. I mentioned it for her, and obtained permission in order to order her out of doors, for the library, where her father stopped a short time daily, the brief period he could bear to sit up, and his chamber, had become her whole world. She grudged each moment that did not find her bending over his pillow, or seated by his side. Her countenance grew wan with watching and sorrow, and my master gladly dismissed her to what he flattered himself would be a happy change of scene and society, drawing comfort from the hope that she would not now be left entirely alone after his death. He had a fixed idea, I guessed, by several observations he let fall, that, as his nephew resembled him in person, he would resemble him in mind, for Linton's letters bore few or no indications of his defective character. and I, through pardonable weakness, refrained from correcting the error, asking myself what good there would be in disturbing his last moments with information that he had neither power nor opportunity to turn to account. We deferred our excursion till the afternoon, a golden afternoon of August, every breath from the hills so full of life that it seemed whoever respired it, though dying, might revive. Catherine's face was just like the landscape, shadows and sunshine flitting over it in rapid succession, but the shadows rested longer, and the sunshine was more transient, and her poor little heart reproached itself for even that passing forgetfulness of its cares. We discerned Linton watching at the same spot he had selected before. My young mistress alighted, and told me that, as she was resolved to stay a very little while, I had better hold the pony and remain on horseback. But I dissented. I wouldn't risk losing sight of the charge committed to me a minute, so we climbed the slope of heath together. Master Heathcliff received us with greater animation on this occasion, not the animation of high spirits, though, nor yet of joy. It looked more like fear. "It is late," he said, speaking short and with difficulty. "Is not your father very ill? I thought you wouldn't come." "Why won't you be candid?" cried Catherine, swallowing her greeting. "Why can't you say at once you don't want me? It is strange, Linton, that for the second time you have brought me here on purpose, apparently to distress us both, and for no reason besides." Linton shivered and glanced at her, half supplicating, half ashamed, but his cousin's patience was not sufficient to endure this enigmatical behavior. "My father is very ill," she said. "And why am I called from his bedside? Why didn't you send to absolve me from my promise, when you wished I wouldn't keep it? Come, I desire an explanation. Playing and trifling are completely banished out of my mind, and I can't dance attendance on your affectations now." "My affectations!" he murmured. "What are they? For heaven's sake, Catherine, don't look so angry. Despise me as much as you please. I am a worthless, cowardly wretch. I can't be scorned enough. But I'm too mean for your anger. Hate my father, and spare me for contempt." "Nonsense!" cried Catherine in passion. "Foolish, silly boy! And there, he trembles, as if I were really going to touch him. You needn't bespeak contempt, Linton. Anybody will have it spontaneously at your service. Get off! I shall return home. It is folly dragging you from the hearthstone, and pretending. What do we pretend? Let go my frock. If I pitied you for crying and looking so very frightened, you should spurn such pity. Ellen, tell him how disgraceful this conduct is. Rise, and don't degrade yourself into an abject reptile. Don't!" With streaming face and an expression of agony, Linton had thrown his nerveless frame along the ground. He seemed convulsed with exquisite terror. "Oh," he sobbed, "I cannot bear it! Catherine, Catherine, I'm a traitor too, and I dare not tell you. But leave me, and I shall be killed. Dear Catherine, my life is in your hands, and you have said you loved me, and if you did, it wouldn't harm you. You'll not go, then? Kind, sweet, good Catherine, and perhaps you will consent, and he'll let me die with you." My young lady, on witnessing his intense anguish, stooped to raise him. The old feeling of indulgent tenderness overcame her vexation, and she grew thoroughly moved and alarmed. "Consent to what?" she asked. "To stay? Tell me the meaning of this strange talk, and I will. You contradict your own words and distract me. Be calm and frank, and confess at once all that weighs on your heart. You wouldn't injure me, Linton, would you? You wouldn't let any enemy hurt me, if you could prevent it? I believe you are a coward, for yourself, but not a cowardly betrayer of your best friend." "But my father threatened me," gasped the boy, clasping his attenuated fingers, "and I dread him. I dare not tell." "Oh, well," said Catherine, with scornful compassion, "keep your secret. I'm no coward. Save yourself. I'm not afraid." Her magnanimity provoked his tears. He wept wildly, kissing her supporting hands, and yet could not summon courage to speak out. I was cogitating what the mystery might be, and determined Catherine should never suffer to benefit him or anyone else by my goodwill, when, hearing a rustle among the ling, I looked up and saw Mr. Heathcliff almost close upon us, descending the heights. He didn't cast a glance toward my companions, though. They were sufficiently near for Linton's sobs to be audible, but hailing me in the almost hearty tone he assumed to none besides, and the sincerity of which I couldn't avoid doubting, he said, "It is something to see you so near to my house, Nelly. How are you at the Grange? Let us hear. The rumor goes," he added in a lower tone, "that Edgar Linton is on his deathbed. Perhaps they exaggerate his illness?" "No. My master is dying, I replied. It is true enough. A sad thing it will be for us all, but a blessing for him. How long will he last, do you think? He asked. I don't know, I said. Because, he continued, looking at the two young people, who were fixed under his eye, Linton appeared as if he could not venture to stir or raise his head, and Catherine could not move on his account. Because that lad yonder seems determined to beat me, and I'd thank his uncle to be quick, and go before him. Hello, has the whelp been playing that game long? I did give him some lessons about sniveling. Is he really pretty lively with Miss Linton generally? Lively? No, he has shown the greatest distress, I answered. To see him, I should say that instead of rambling with his sweetheart on the hills, he ought to be in bed, under the hands of a doctor. He shall be, in a day or two, muttered Heathcliff. But first, get up, Linton, get up, he shouted. Don't grovel on the ground there. Up, this moment! Linton had sunk prostrate again, in another paroxysm of helpless fear, caused by his father's glance toward him, I suppose. There was nothing else to produce such humiliation. He made several efforts to obey, but his little strength was annihilated for the time, and he fell back again with a moan. Mr. Heathcliff advanced, and lifted him to lean against a ridge of turf. Now, said he, with curbed ferocity, I'm getting angry, and if you don't command that paltry spirit of yours, damn you, get up directly! I will, father, he panted. Only, let me alone, or I shall faint. I've done as you wished, I'm sure. Catherine will tell you that I have been cheerful. Ah, keep by me. Catherine, give me your hand. Take mine, said his father. Stand on your feet. There now. She'll lend you her arm. That's right. Look at her. You would imagine I was the devil himself, Miss Linton, to excite such horror. Be so kind as to walk home with him, will you? He shudders if I touch him. Linton, dear, whispered Catherine, I can't go to Wuthering Heights. Papa has forbidden me. He'll not harm you. Why are you so afraid? I can never re-enter that house, he answered. I'm not to re-enter it without you. Stop, cried his father. We'll respect Catherine's filial scruples. Nellie, take him in, and I'll follow your advice concerning the doctor, without delay. You'll do well, replied I, but I must remain with my mistress. To mind your son is not my business. You are very stiff, said Heathcliff. I know that, but you'll force me to pinch the baby and make it scream before it moves your charity. Come then, my hero, are you willing to return, escorted by me? He approached once more, and made as if he would seize the fragile being, but, shrinking back, Linton clung to his cousin, and implored her to accompany him, with a frantic importunity that admitted no denial. However I disproved, I couldn't hinder her. Indeed, how could she have refused him herself? What was filling him with dread we had no means of discerning. But there he was, powerless under its gripe, and any addition seemed capable of shocking him into idiocy. We reached the threshold. Catherine walked in, and I stood waiting till she had conducted the invalid to a chair, expecting her out immediately, when Mr. Heathcliff, pushing me forward, exclaimed, My house is not stricken with the plague, Nellie, and I have a mind to be hospitable today. Sit down and allow me to shut the door. He shut and locked it also. I started. You shall have tea before you go home, he added. I am by myself. Hareton has gone with some cattle to the Lees, and Zillah and Joseph are off on a journey of pleasure, and, though I'm used to being alone, I'd rather have some interesting company, if I can get it. Miss Linton, take your seat by him. I give you what I have. The present is hardly worth accepting, but I have nothing else to offer. It is Linton, I mean. How does she stare? It's odd what a savage feeling I have to anything that seems afraid of me. Had I been born where laws are less strict and tastes less dainty, I should treat myself to a slow vivisection of those two as an evening's amusement. He drew in his breath, struck the table, and swore to himself. By hell, I hate them! I am not afraid of you, exclaimed Catherine, who could not hear the latter part of his speech. She stepped close up, her black eyes flashing with passion and resolution. Give me that key. I will have it, she said. I wouldn't eat or drink here if I were starving. Heathcliff had the key in his hand that remained on the table. He looked up, seized with a sort of surprise at her boldness, or possibly reminded by her voice and glance of the person from whom she inherited it. She snatched at the instrument, and half succeeded in getting it out of his loosened fingers, but her action recalled him to the present. He recovered it speedily. Now, Catherine Linton, he said, stand off, or I shall knock you down, and that will make Mrs. Dean mad. Regardless of his warning, she captured his closed hand and its contents again. We will go, she repeated, exerting her utmost efforts to cause the iron muscles to relax, and finding that her nails made no impression, she applied her teeth pretty sharply. Heathcliff glanced at me, a glance that kept me from interfering a moment. Catherine was too intent on his fingers to notice his face. He opened them, suddenly, and resigned the object of dispute. But ere she had well secured it, he seized her with the liberated hand, and pulling her on his knee, administered with the other a shower of terrific slaps on both sides of the head, each sufficient to have fulfilled his threat, had she been able to fall. At this diabolical violence I rushed on him furiously. "You villain!" I began to cry. "You villain!" A touch on the chest silenced me. I am stout, and soon put out of breath, and, what with that and the rage, I staggered dizzyingly back, and felt ready to suffocate, or to burst a blood vessel. The scene was over in 2 minutes. Catherine, released, put her 2 hands to her temples, and looked just as if she were not sure whether her ears were off or on. She trembled like a reed, poor thing, and leant against the table, perfectly bewildered. "I know how to chastise children, you see," said the scoundrel grimly, as he stooped to repossess himself of the key, which had dropped to the floor. "Go to Linton now, as I told you, and cry at your ease. I shall be your father tomorrow, all the father you'll have in a few days, and you shall have plenty of that. You can bear plenty. You are no weakling. You shall have a daily taste, if I catch such a devil of a temper in your eyes again." Cathy ran to me instead of Linton, and knelt down and put her burning cheek on my lap, weeping aloud. Her cousin had shrunk into a corner of the settle, as quiet as a mouse, congratulating himself, I dare say, that the correction had alighted on another than him. Mr. Heathcliff, perceiving us all confounded, rose and expeditiously made the tea himself. The cups and saucers were laid ready. He poured it out and handed me a cup. "Wash away your spleen," he said, "and help your own naughty pet and mine. It is not poisoned, though I prepared it. I'm going out to seek your horses." Our first thought on his departure was to force an exit somewhere. We tried the kitchen door, but that was fastened outside. We looked at the windows. They were too narrow for even Cathy's little figure. "Master Linton," I cried, seeing we were regularly imprisoned, "you know what your diabolical father is after, and you shall tell us, or I'll box your ears, as he has done your cousin's." "Yes, Linton, you must tell," said Catherine. "It was for your sake I came, and it will be wickedly ungrateful if you refuse." "Give me some tea, I'm thirsty, and then I'll tell you," he answered. "Mrs. Dean, go away. I don't like you standing over me. Now, Catherine, you are letting your tears fall into my cup. I won't drink that. Give me another." Catherine pushed another to him and wiped her face. I felt disgusted at the little wretch's composure, since he was no longer in terror for himself. The anguish he had exhibited on the moor subsided as soon as he had entered Wuthering Heights, so I guessed he had been menaced with an awful visitation of wrath if he failed in decoying us here, and that accomplished, he had no further immediate fears. "Papa wants us to be married," he continued, after sipping some of the liquid, "and he knows your papa wouldn't let us marry now, and he's afraid of my dying if we wait. So we are to be married in the morning, and you are to stay here all night, and, if you do as he wishes, you shall return home next day and take me with you." "Take you with her, pitiful changeling!" I exclaimed. "You marry! Why, the man is mad, or he thinks us fools, every one. And do you imagine that beautiful young lady, that healthy, hearty girl, will tie herself to a little perishing monkey like you? Are you cherishing the notion that anybody, let alone Miss Catherine Linton, would have you for a husband? You want whipping for bringing us all in here at all, with your dastardly pulling tricks. And don't look so silly now. I've a very good mind to shake you severely for your contemptible treachery and your imbecile conceit." I did give him a slight shaking, but it brought on the cough, and he took to his ordinary resource of moaning and weeping, and Catherine rebuked me. "Stay all night? No," she said, looking slowly around. "Ellen, I'll burn that door down, but I'll get out." And she would have commenced the execution of her threat directly, but Linton was up in alarm for his dear self again. He clasped her in his 2 feeble arms, sobbing, "Won't you have me, and save me? Not let me come to the Grange? Oh, darling Catherine, you mustn't go and leave, after all. You must obey my father. You must!" "I must obey my own," she replied, "and relieve him from this cruel suspense. The whole night! What would he think? He'll be distressed already. I'll either break or burn away out of the house. Be quiet. You're in no danger, but if you hinder me, Linton, I love Papa better than you." The mortal terror he felt of Mr. Heathcliff's anger restored to the boy his coward's eloquence. Catherine was near distraught. Still, she persisted that she must go home, and tried entreaty in her turn. Persuading him to subdue his selfish agony while they were thus occupied, our jailer re-entered. Your beasts have trotted off, he said, and, now, Linton, sniveling again. What has she been doing to you? Come, come, have done, and get to bed. In a month or two, my lad, you'll be able to pay her back her present tyrannies with a rigorous hand. You're pining for pure love, are you not? Nothing else in the world, and she shall have you. There, to bed. Zillah won't be here tonight. You must undress yourself. Hush, hold your noise. Once in your own room, I'll not come near you. You needn't fear. By chance, you've managed tolerably. I'll look to the rest. He spoke these words, holding the door open for his son to pass, and the latter achieved his exit exactly as a spaniel might which suspected the person who attended it of designing a spiteful squeeze. The lock was secured. Heathcliff approached the fire, where my mistress and I stood silent. Catherine looked up, and instinctively raised her hand to her cheek. His neighborhood revived a painful sensation. Anybody else would have been incapable of regarding the child act with sternness, but he scowled on her and muttered, "Oh, you are not afraid of me. Your courage is well disguised. You seem damnably afraid." "I am afraid now," she replied, "because if I stay, Papa will be miserable, and how can I endure making him miserable when he... Mr. Heathcliff, let me go home. I promised Mary Linton. Papa would like me to, and I love him. Why should you wish to force me to do what I'll willingly do of myself?" "Let him dare to force you," I cried. "There's law in the land, thank God. There is. Though we be in an out-of-the-way place, I'd inform if he were my own son, and it's felony without benefit of clergy." "Silence," said the ruffian. "To the devil with your clamor. I don't want you to speak. Miss Linton, I shall enjoy myself remarkably in thinking your father will be miserable. I shall not sleep for satisfaction. You could have hit on no surer way of fixing your residence under my roof for the next 24 hours than informing me that such an event would follow. As to your promise to Mary Linton, I'll take care you shall keep it, for you shall not quit this place till it is fulfilled." "Send Ellen, then, to let Papa know I'm safe," exclaimed Catherine, weeping bitterly. "Or marry me now. Poor Papa! Ellen, he'll think we're lost. What shall we do?" "Not he. He'll think you are tired of waiting on him, and run off for a little amusement," answered Heathcliff. "You cannot deny that you entered my house of your own accord, in contempt of his injunctions to the contrary, and it is quite natural that you should desire amusement at your age, and that you would weary of nursing a sick man, and that man only your father. Catherine, his happiest days were over when your days began. He cursed you, I dare say, for coming into the world. I did, at least. And it would just do if he cursed you as he went out of it. I join him. I don't love you. How should I? Weep away. As far as I can see, it will be your chief diversion hereafter, unless Linton makes amends for the other losses, and your provident parent appears to be fancy he may. His letters of advice and consolation entertained me vastly. In his last he recommended my Jewel to be careful of his, and kind to her when he got her. Careful and kind. That's paternal, but Linton requires his whole stock of care and kindness for himself. Linton can play the little tyrant well. He'll undertake to torture any number of cats if their teeth be drawn and their claws spared. You'll be able to tell his uncle fine tales of his kindness when you get home again, I assure you." "You're right there," I said. "Explain your son's character. Show his resemblance to yourself, and then, I hope, Miss Cathy will think twice before she takes the cockatrice." I don't much mind speaking of his amiable qualities now," he answered, "because she must either accept him or remain a prisoner, and you along with her, till your master dies. I can detain you both, quite concealed here. If you doubt, encourage her to retract her word, and you'll have an opportunity of judging." "I'll not retract my word," said Catherine. "I'll marry him, within this hour, if I may go to Thrushcross Grange afterwards. Mr. Heathcliff, you're a cruel man, but you're not a fiend, and you won't, from mere malice, destroy irrevocably all my happiness. If Papa thought I had left him on purpose, and if he died before I returned, could I bear to live? I've given over crying, but I'm going to kneel here, at your knee, and I'll not get up, and I'll not take my eye from your face till you look back at me. No, don't turn away. Do look! You'll see nothing to provoke you. I don't hate you. I'm not angry that you struck me. Have you never loved anybody in all your life, uncle? Never! Ah, you must look once. I'm so wretched, you can't help being sorry and pitying me." "Keep your F's fingers off and move, or I'll kick you," cried Heathcliff, brutally repulsing her. "I'd rather be hugged by a snake. How the devil can you dream of fawning on me? I detest you!" He shrugged his shoulders, shook himself, indeed, as if his flesh crept with aversion, and thrust back his chair, while I got up, and opened my mouth to commence a downright torrent of abuse, but I was rendered dumb in the middle of the first sentence by a threat that I should be thrown into a room by myself the very next syllable I uttered. It was growing dark. We heard a sound of voices at the garden gate. Our host hurried out instantly. He had his wits about him. We had not. There was a talk of 2 or 3 minutes, and he returned alone. I thought it had been your cousin Hareton, I observed to Catherine. I wish he would arrive. Who knows but he might take our part. It was 3 servants, sent to seek you from the Grange, said Heathcliff, overhearing me. You should have opened a lattice and called out, but I could swear that chit is glad you didn't. She's glad to be obliged to stay, I'm certain. At learning the chance we had missed, we both gave vent to our grief without control, and he allowed us to wail on till 9 o'clock. Then he bid us go upstairs, through the kitchen, to Zilla's chamber, and I whispered my companion to obey. Perhaps we might contrive to get through the window there, or into a garret, and out by its skylight. The window, however, was narrow, like those below, and the garret trap was safe from our attempts, for we were fastened in as before. We neither of us lay down. Catherine took her station by the lattice, and watched anxiously for morning, a deep sigh being the only answer I could obtain to my frequent entreaties that she would try to rest. I seated myself in a chair and rocked to and fro, passing harsh judgment on my many derelictions of duty, from which, it struck me then, all the misfortune of my employers sprang. It was not the case in reality, I am aware, but it was, in my imagination, that dismal night, and I thought Heathcliff himself less guilty than I. At 7 o'clock he came, and inquired if Miss Linton had risen. She ran to the door immediately, and answered, "Yes, here, then," he said, opening it and pulling her out. I rose to follow, but he turned the lock again. I demanded my release. "Be patient," he replied. "I'll send up your breakfast in a while." I thumped on the panels, and rattled the latch angrily, and Catherine asked why I was still shut up. He answered, I must try to endure it another hour, and then went away. I endured it 2 or 3 hours at length. I heard a footstep, not of Heathcliff's. "I brought you something to eat," said a voice. "Open the door." Complying eagerly, I beheld Hareton, laden with food enough to last me all day. "Take it," he added, thrusting the tray into my hand. "Stay 1 minute," I began. "Nay," cried he, and retired, regardless of any prayers I could put forth to detain him. And there I remained enclosed the whole day, and the whole of the next night, and another, and another. 5 nights and 4 days I remained, altogether seeing nobody but Hareton once every morning, and he was a model of a jailer, surly and dumb and deaf to every attempt at moving his sense of justice or compassion. And that brings us to the end of chapter 27. And wow! Okay, so we just escalated straight into criminal kidnapping at this point. That was a twist I didn't exactly expect. Wow. That's the intense bastardry we talked about earlier. That's just been dialed up to 11. Well, let's carry on, because we'll just ride this momentum through the next chapter. And so we have chapter 28. On the 5th morning, or rather afternoon, a different step approached, lighter and shorter, and this time the person entered the room. It was Zilla, donned in her scarlet shawl, with a black silk bonnet on her head, and a willow basket swung to her arm. Dear Mrs. Dean," she exclaimed. "Well, there is talk about you at Gimmerton. I never thought but you were sunk in the Black Horse Marsh, and Missy with you, till Master told me you'd been found, and he'd lodged you here. What, and you must have got on an island, sure. And how long were you in the hole? Did Master save you, Mrs. Dean? But you're not so thin. You've not been so poorly, have you?" "Your master is a true scoundrel," I replied. "But he shall answer for it. He needn't have raised that tale. It shall all be laid bare." "What do you mean?" asked Zilla. "It's not his tale. They tell that in the village, about your being lost in the marsh. And I calls to Earnshaw when I come in. These queer things, Mr. Hareton, happened since I went off. It's a sad pity of that likely young lass, and can't Nelly Dean." He stared. I thought he had heard aught, so I told him the rumor. The master listened, and he just smiled to himself and said, "If they have been in the marsh, they are out now, Zilla. Nelly Dean is lodged, at this minute, in your room. You can tell her to flit when you go up. Here's the key. The bog water got into her head, and she would have run home quite flighty, but I fixed her till she came round to her senses. You can bid her go to the Grange at once, if she be able, and carry a message from me, that a young lady will follow in time to attend the squire's funeral." "Mr. Edgar is not dead," I gasped. "Oh, Zillah, Zillah!" "No, no, sit you down, my good mistress," she replied. "You're right sickly yet. He's not dead. Dr. Kenneth thinks he may last another day. I met him on the road and asked." Instead of sitting down, I snatched my outdoor things and hastened below, for the way was free. On entering the house, I looked about for someone to give information of Catherine. The place was filled with sunshine, and the doors stood wide open, but nobody seemed at hand. As I hesitated whether to go off at once, or return to seek my mistress, a slight cough drew my attention to the hearth. Linton lay on the settle, sole tenant, sucking a stick of sugar candy, and pursuing my movements with apathetic eyes. "Where is Miss Catherine?" I demanded sternly, supposing I could frighten him into giving intelligence by catching him thus, alone. He sucked on like an innocent. "Is she gone?" I said. "No," he replied. "She's upstairs. She's not to go. We won't let her." "You won't let her? Little idiot!" I exclaimed. "Direct me to her room immediately, or I'll make you sing out sharply." "Papa would make you sing out if you attempted to get there," he answered. "He says I'm not to be soft with Catherine. She's my wife, and it's shameful that she should wish to leave me. He says she hates me and wants me to die, and that she may have my money, but she shan't have it, and she shan't go home. She never shall. She may cry and be sick as much as she pleases." He resumed his former occupation, closing his lids as if he meant to drop asleep. "Master Heathcliff," I resumed, "have you forgotten all Catherine's kindness to you last winter, when you affirmed you loved her, and when she brought you books and sung you songs, and came many a time through wind and snow to see you? She wept to miss one evening because you would be disappointed, and you felt then that she was 100 times too good to you, and now you believe the lies your father tells, though you know he detests you both, and you join him against her. That's fine gratitude, is it not?" The corner of Linton's mouth fell, and he took the sugar candy from his lips. "Did she come to Wuthering Heights because she hated you?" I continued. "Think for yourself. As to your money, she does not even know that you will have any, and you say she's sick, and yet you leave her alone, up there, in a strange house. You, who have felt what it is to be so neglected. You could pity your own sufferings, and she pitied them, too, but you won't pity hers. I shed tears, Master Heathcliff, you see, an elderly woman, and a servant merely, and you, after pretending such affection, and having reason to worship her almost, store every tear you have for yourself, and lie there quite at ease. Ah, you're a heartless, selfish boy." "I can't stay with her," he answered crossly. "I'll not stay by myself. She cries, so I can't bear it, and she won't give over, though I say I'll call my father. I did call him once, and he threatened to strangle her if she was not quiet, but she began again the instant he left the room, moaning and grieving all night long, though I screamed for vexation that I couldn't sleep." "Is Mr. Heathcliff out?" I inquired, perceiving that the wretched creature had no power to sympathize with his cousin's mental tortures. "He's in the court," he replied, "talking to Dr. Kenneth, who says uncle is dying, truly, at last. I'm glad, for I shall be master of the Grange after him. Catherine always spoke of it as her house. It isn't hers, it's mine. Papa says everything she has is mine. All her nice books are mine. She offered to give me them, and her pretty birds, and her pony, Minnie, and if I would get the key of our room, and let her out, but I told her she had nothing to give. They were all mine, and then she cried, and took a little picture from her neck, and said I should have that. 2 pictures in a gold case. On one side, her mother, on the other, the uncle, when they were young. That was yesterday. I said they were mine too, and tried to get them from her. The spiteful thing wouldn't let me. She pushed me off and hurt me. I shrieked out. That frightened her. She heard Papa coming, and she broke the hinges and divided the case, and gave her mother's portrait. The other she attempted to hide, but Papa asked what was the matter, and I explained it. He took the one I had away, and ordered her to resign hers to me. She refused, and he struck her down, and wrenched it off the chain, and crushed it with his foot." "And were you pleased to see her struck?" I asked, having my designs in encouraging his talk. "I winked," he answers. "I winked to see my father strike a dog or a horse. He does it so hard. Yet I was glad at first. She deserved punishing for punishing me. But when Papa was gone, she made me come to the window, and showed me her cheek cut on the inside, against her teeth, and her mouth filling with blood. And then she gathered up the bits of the picture, and went and sat down with her face to the wall, and she has never spoken to me since. And I sometimes think she can't speak for pain. I don't like to think so, but she's a naughty thing for crying continually, and she looks so pale and wild, I'm afraid of her. And you can get the key if you choose, I said. Yes, when I'm upstairs, he answered, but I can't walk upstairs now. In what apartment is it? I asked. Oh, he cried, I shan't tell you where it is. It is our secret. Nobody, neither Hareton nor Zillah, is to know. There, you've tired me. Go away, go away! And he turned his face onto his arm and shut his eyes again. I considered it best to depart without seeing Mr. Heathcliff, and bring a rescue for my young lady from the Grange. On reaching it, the astonishment of my fellow servants to see me, and their joy also, was intense, and when they heard that their little mistress was safe, 2 or 3 were about to hurry up and shout the news at Mr. Edgar's door, but I bespoke the announcement of it myself. How changed I found him, even in those few days. He lay an image of sadness and resignation awaiting his death. Very young he looked, though his actual age was 39. One would have called him 10 years younger, at least. He thought of Catherine, for he murmured her name. I touched his hand and spoke. Catherine is coming, dear master, I whispered. She is alive and well, and will be here, I hope, tonight. I trembled at the first effects of this intelligence. He half rose up. He looked eagerly round the apartment, and then sank back in a swoon, as soon as he recovered. I related our compulsory visit and detention at the Heights. I said Heathcliff forced me to go in, which was not quite true. I uttered as little as possible against Linton, nor did I describe all his father's brutal conduct, my intentions being to add no bitterness, if I could help it, to his already overflowing cup. He divined that one of his enemy's purpose was to secure the personal property, as well as the estate, to his son, rather himself. Yet why he did not wait until his decease was a puzzle to my master, because ignorant how nearly he and his nephew would quit the world together. However, he felt that his will had better be altered. Instead of leaving Catherine's fortune at her own disposal, he determined to put it in the hands of trustees for her use during life, and for her children, if she had any, after her. By that means, it could not fall to Mr. Heathcliff should Linton die. Having received his orders, I dispatched a man to fetch the attorney, and 4 more, provided with serviceable weapons, to demand my young lady of her jailer. Both parties were delayed very late. The single servant returned first. He said Mr. Green, the lawyer, was out when he arrived at his house, and he had to wait 2 hours for his re-entrance. And then Mr. Green told him he had a little business in the village that must be done, but he would be at Thrushcross Grange before the morning. The 4 men came back unaccompanied also. They brought word that Catherine was ill, too ill to quit her room, and Heathcliff would not suffer them to see her. I scolded the stupid fellow as well for listening to that tale, which I would not carry to my master, resolving to take a whole bevy up to the Heights at daylight, and storm it literally, unless the prisoner were quietly surrendered to us. Her father shall see her, I vowed, and vowed again, if that devil be killed on his own doorstones in trying to prevent it. Happily, I was spared the journey and the trouble. I had gone downstairs at 3 o'clock to fetch a jug of water, and was passing through the hall with it in my hand, when a sharp knock at the front door made me jump. Oh, it is Green, I said, recollecting myself. Only Green, and I went on, intending to send somebody else to open it, but the knock was repeated, not loud, and still importunately. I put the jug on the banister and hastened to admit him myself. The harvest moon shone clear outside. It was not the attorney. My own sweet little mistress sprang on my neck, sobbing, "Ellen, Ellen, is Papa alive?" "Yes," I cried. "Yes, my angel, he is. God be thanked. You are safe with us again." She wanted to run, breathless as she was, upstairs to Mr. Linton's room, but I compelled her to sit down on a chair and made her drink, and washed her pale face, chafing it into a faint color with my apron. Then I said I must go first, and tell of her arrival, imploring her to say she should be happy with young Heathcliff. She stared, but soon comprehending why I counselled her to utter the falsehood, she assured me she would not complain. I couldn't abide to be present at the meeting. I stood outside the chamber door a quarter of an hour, and hardly ventured near the bed then. All was composed, however. Catherine's despair was as silent as her father's joy. She supported him calmly, in appearance, and he fixed on her features his raised eyes that seemed dilating with ecstasy. He died blissfully, Mr. Lockwood. He died so. Kissing her cheek, he murmured, "I am going to her, and you, darling child, shall come to us," and never stirred or spoke again, but continued that rapt, radiant gaze, till his pulse imperceptibly stopped and his soul departed. None could have noticed the exact minute of his death. it was so entirely without a struggle. Whether Catherine had spent her tears, or whether the grief were too weighty to let them flow, she sat there, dry-eyed, till the sun rose. She sat till noon, and would still have remained brooding over that deathbed, but I insisted on her coming away and taking some repose. It was well I succeeded in removing her, for at dinner time appeared the lawyer, having called at Wuthering Heights to get his instructions how to behave. He had sold himself to Mr. Heathcliff. That was the cause of his delay in obeying my master's summons. Fortunately, no thought of worldly affairs crossed the latter's mind to disturb him after his daughter's arrival. Mr. Green took upon himself to order everything and everybody about the place. He gave all the servants but me notice to quit. He would have carried his delegated authority to the point of insisting that Edgar Linton should not be buried beside his wife, but in the chapel with his family. There was the will, however, to hinder that, and my loud protestations against any infringement of its directions. The funeral was hurried over. Catherine, Mrs. Linton Heathcliff now, was suffered to stay at the Grange till her father's corpse had quitted it. She told me that her anguish had at last spurred Linton to incur the risk of liberating her. She heard the men I spent disputing at the door, and she gathered the sense of Heathcliff's to answer. It drove her desperate. Linton, who had been conveyed up to the little parlour soon as I left, was terrified into fetching the key before his father reascended. He had the cunning to unlock and relock the door without shutting it, and when he should have gone to bed, he begged to sleep with Hareton, and his petition was granted for once. Catherine stole out before break of day. She dared not try the doors, lest the dog should raise an alarm. She visited the empty chambers and examined their windows, and luckily, lighting on her mother's, she got easily out of its lattice and on to the ground by means of the fir tree close by. Her accomplice suffered for his share in the escape, notwithstanding his timid contrivances. And that brings us to the end of chapter 28, wherein Heathcliff is a right bastard. Yeah, I know when we were talking at the beginning, how like, oh, there might be some redemption or some regret. No, there's none of that. This is full on, everything out in the open, the worst of the worst, and it only keeps going downhill faster. Thought we were at rock bottom. They found a way to break right through that. Lord almighty. Alright. Yeah, Linton is every bit as bad. Like, you can say, oh, there's some excuses to be made for bad upbringing, for returning what you've been given, or cycling back what you know, but no. That is just horrible. There's a point where it's beyond common decency or sense or even acceptability. The most patient and kind people would still judge that harshly. Well, and he's not even really a child. He's like 17 or 18 at this point. So like, you're old enough to know right from wrong at that point. I'd be a little bit more forgiving if he was still like a young teen, and even then I'd still judge that harshly. But he's about a man grown, especially for the time this was written. Yeah, you should be able to tell, but I think morality is obviously lacking in this household, and yeah, it's frustrating, honestly. Well, let's carry that into the next chapter. While I've still got some heat in the tone. So we come to chapter 29. The evening after the funeral, my young lady and I were seated in the library, now musing mournfully, one of us despairingly, on our loss, now venturing conjectures as to the gloomy future. We had just agreed the best destiny which could await Catherine would be a permission to continue resident at the Grange, at least during Linton's life, he being allowed to join her there, and I to remain as housekeeper. That seemed rather too favourable an arrangement to be hoped for, and yet I did hope, and began to cheer up under the prospect of retaining my home and my employment, and, above all, my beloved young mistress, when a servant, one of the discarded ones, not yet departed, rushed hastily in, and said that devil Heathcliff was coming through the court. Should he fasten the door in his face? If we had been mad enough to order that proceeding, we had not time. He made no ceremony of knocking or announcing his name. He was the master, and availed himself of the master's privilege to walk straight in, without saying a word. The sound of our informant's voice directed him to the library. He entered, and motioning him out, shut the door. It was the same room into which he had been ushered, as a guest, 18 years before. The same moon shone through the window, and the same autumn landscape lay outside. We had not yet lighted a candle, but all the apartment was visible, even to the portraits on the wall, the splendid head of Mrs. Linton, and the graceful one of her husband. Heathcliff advanced to the hearth. Time had little altered his person either. There was the same man, his dark face rather sallower and more composed, his frame a stone or two heavier, perhaps, and no other difference. Catherine had risen with an impulse to dash out when she saw him. "Stop!" he said, arresting her by the arm. "No more runnings away. Where would you go? I'm come to fetch you home, and I hope you'll be a dutiful daughter and not encourage my son to further disobedience. I was embarrassed how to punish him when I discovered his part in the business. He's such a cobweb, a pinch would annihilate him, but you'll see by his look that he has received his due. I brought him down one evening, the day before yesterday, and just set him in a chair, and never touched him afterwards. I sent Hareton out, and we had the room to ourselves. In 2 hours I called Joseph to carry him up again, and since then my presence is as potent on his nerves as a ghost, and I fancy he sees me often, though I am not near. Hareton says he wakes and shrieks in the night by the hour together, and calls you to protect him from me, and, whether you like your precious mate or not, you must come. He's your concern now. I yield all my interest in him to you." "Why not let Catherine continue here," I pleaded, "and send Master Linton to her? As you hate them both, you'd not miss them. They can only be a daily plague to your unnatural heart." "I'm seeking a tenant for the Grange," he answered, "and I want my children about me, to be sure. Besides, that lass owes me her services for her bread. I'm not going to nurture her in luxury and idleness after Linton is gone. Make haste, and get ready now, and don't oblige me to compel you." "I shall," said Catherine. "Linton is all I have to love in the world, and though you have done what you could to make him hateful to me, and me to him, you cannot make us hate each other. And I defy you to hurt him when I am by, and I defy you to frighten me." "You are a boastful champion," replied Heathcliff, "but I don't like you well enough to hurt him. You shall get the full benefit of the torment, as long as it lasts. It is not I who will make him hateful to you. It is his own sweet spirit. He's as bitter as gall at your desertion of it and its consequences. Don't expect thanks for this noble devotion. I heard him draw a pleasant picture to Zillah of what he would do if he were as strong as I. The inclination is there, and his very weakness will sharpen his wits to find a substitute for strength." "I know he has a bad nature," said Catherine. "He's your son. But I'm glad I've a better to forgive it, and I know he loves me, and for that reason I love him. Mr. Heathcliff, you have nobody to love you, and however miserable you make us, we shall still have the revenge of thinking that your cruelty arises from your greater misery. You are miserable, are you not? Lonely like the devil, and envious like him? Nobody loves you. Nobody will cry for you when you die. I wouldn't be you." Catherine spoke with a kind of dreary triumph. She seemed to have made up her mind to enter into the spirit of her future family, and draw pleasure from the griefs of her enemies. "You shall be sorry to yourself presently," said her father-in-law, "if you stand there another minute. Begone, witch, and get your things." She scornfully withdrew. In her absence, I began to beg for Zillah's place at the Heights, offering to resign mine to her, but he would suffer it on no account. He bid me be silent, and then, for the first time, allowed himself a glance round the room and a look at the pictures. Having studied Mrs. Linton's, he said, "I shall have that home, not because I need it, but—" He turned abruptly to the fire and continued, with what, for lack of a better word, I must call a smile. "I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got the sexton, who was digging Linton's grave, to remove the earth off her coffin lid, and I opened it. I thought, once, I would have stayed there, when I saw her face again. It is hers yet. He had work done to stir me, but he said it would change if the air blew on it. So I struck one side of the coffin loose and covered it up. Not Linton's side, damn him. I wish he'd been soldered in lead. And I bribed the sexton to pull it away when I'm laid there, and slide mine out too. I'll have it made so, and then, by the time Linton gets to us, he'll not know which is which." "You were very wicked, Mr. Heathcliff," I exclaimed. "Were you not ashamed to disturb the dead?" "I disturbed nobody, Nellie," he replied, "and I gave some ease to myself. I shall be a great deal more comfortable now, and you'll have a better chance of keeping me underground when I get there. Disturbed her? No, she has disturbed me, night and day through 18 years, incessantly, remorselessly, till yesternight, and yesternight I was tranquil. I dreamt I was sleeping the last sleep by that sleeper, with my heart stopped, and my cheek frozen against hers. And if she had been dissolved into earth, or worse, what would have you dreamt of then?" I said. "Of dissolving with her, and being more happy still," he answered. "Do you suppose I dread of any change of that sort? I expected such a transformation on raising the lid, but I'm better pleased that it should not commence till I share it. Besides, unless I have received a distinct impression of her passionless features, that strange feeling would hardly have been removed. It began oddly, you know. I was wild after she died, and eternally, from dawn to dawn, praying her to return to me her spirit. I have a strong faith in ghosts. I have a conviction that they can and do exist among us. The day she was buried, there came a fall of snow. In the evening, I went to the churchyard. It blew bleak as winter. All round was solitary. I didn't fear that her fool of a husband would wander up the glen so late, and no one else had business to bring them there. Being alone and conscious, 2 yards of loose earth was the sole barrier between us. I said to myself, I'll have her in my arms again. If she be cold, I'll think it is this north wind that chills me. And if she is motionless, it is sleep. I got a spade from the tool house and began to delve with all my might. It scraped the coffin. I fell to work with my hands. The wood commenced cracking about the screws. I was on the point of attaining my object when it seemed that I heard a sigh from someone above, close at the edge of the grave. And bending down, "If I can only get this off," I muttered, "I wish that they may shovel in the earth over us both." And I wrenched at it, more desperately still. There was another sigh, close at my ear. I appeared to feel the warm breath of it displacing the sleet-laden wind. I knew no living thing in flesh and blood was by, but as certainly as you perceive the approach of some substantial body in the dark, though it cannot be discerned, so certainly I felt that Kathy was there, not under me, but on the earth. A sudden sense of relief flowed from my heart through every limb. I relinquished my labor of agony, and turned, consoled at once, unspeakably consoled. Her presence was with me. It remained while I refilled the grave, and led me home. You may laugh if you will, but I was sure I should see her there. I was sure she was with me, and I could not help talking to her. Having reached the heights, I rushed eagerly to the door. It was fastened, and I remember that accursed Earnshaw and my wife opposed my entrance. I remember stopping to kick the breath out of him, and then hurrying upstairs to my room and hers. I looked round impatiently. I felt her by me. I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervor of my supplications to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me. And since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture, infernal, keeping my nerves at such a stretch that if they had not resembled catgut, they would long ago have relaxed to the feebleness of lintons. When I sat in the house with Hareton, it seemed that on going out I should meet her. When I walked on the moors, I should meet her coming in. When I went from home, I hastened to return. She must be somewhere at the heights, I was certain. And when I slept in her chamber, I was beaten out of that. I couldn't lie there. For the moment I closed my eyes, she was either outside the window or sliding back the panels, or entering the room, or even resting her darling head on the same pillow as she did when a child. And I must open my lids to see, and so I opened and closed them 100 times a night. To be always disappointed, it racked me. I've often groaned aloud, till that old rascal Joseph no doubt believed that my conscience was playing the fiend inside of me. Now, since I've seen her, I'm pacified. A little. It was a strange way of killing, not by inches, but by fractions of hairbreadths, to beguile me with the spectre of a hope through 18 years. Mr. Heathcliff paused and wiped his forehead. His hair clung to it, wet with perspiration. His eyes were fixed on the red embers of the fire, the brows not contracted, but raised next to the temples, diminishing the grim aspect of his countenance, but imparting a peculiar look of trouble and a painful appearance of mental tension towards one absorbing object. He only half addressed me, and I maintained silence. I didn't like to hear him talk. After a short period, he resumed his meditation on the picture, took it down, and leant it against the sofa to contemplate it at better advantage. And while so occupied, Catherine appeared, announcing that she was ready, when her pony should be saddled. "Send that over tomorrow," said Heathcliff to me. Then, turning to her, he added, "You may do without your pony. It is a fine evening, and you'll need no ponies at Wuthering Heights for what journeys you take. Your own feet will serve you. Come along." "Goodbye, Ellen," whispered my dear little mistress, as she kissed me. Her lips felt like ice. "Come and see me, Ellen. Don't forget." "Take care you do no such thing, Mrs. Dean," said her new father. "When I wish to speak to you, I'll come here. I want none of your prying at my house." He signed her to precede him, and casting back a look that cut my heart, she obeyed. I watched them, from the window, walk down the garden. Heathcliff fixed Catherine's arm under his, though she disputed the act at first evidently, and with rapid strides he hurried her into the alley, whose trees concealed them. And that brings us to the end of chapter 29. Woo! So, he's got a few screws loose there. Yeah, I mean, to have that level of obsession and cruelty and just meanness, you kind of expect it to be mad, but that's definitely, there's no forgiving it because of the madness. But, yikes. Yikes, 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 yikes. And that whole speech of Heathcliff's as he was going through his haunting, that was all one paragraph. The whole page was one paragraph without breaks. It left me about breathless. Alright, the next one is looking kind of short, so let's get through this, and then probably take a break after that. So we come to chapter 30. I have paid a visit to the Heights, but I have not seen her since she left. Joseph held the door in his hand when I called to ask after her, and wouldn't let me pass. He said Mrs. Linton was thrang, and the master was not in. Zillah has told me something of the way they go on, otherwise I should hardly know who was dead and who living. She thinks Catherine haughty, and does not like her. I can guess by her talk. My young lady asked some aid of her when she first came, but Mr. Heathcliff told her to follow her own business, and let his daughter-in-law look after herself, and Zillah willingly acquiesced, being a narrow-minded, selfish woman. Catherine evinced a child's annoyance at this neglect, repaid it with contempt, and thus enlisted my informant among her enemies. As securely as if she had done her some great wrong, I had a long talk with Zillah about 6 weeks ago, a little before you came. One day when we foregathered on the moor, and this is what she told me. The first thing Mrs. Linton did, she said, on her arrival at the Heights, was to run upstairs, without even wishing good evening to me and Joseph. She shut herself into Linton's rooms, and remained till morning. Then, while the master and Urchel were at breakfast, she entered the house, and asked, all in a quiver, if the doctor might be sent for. Her cousin was very ill. We know that, answered Heathcliff, but his life is not worth a farthing, and I won't spend a farthing on him. But I cannot tell how to do, she said, and if nobody will help me, he'll die. Walk out of the room, cried the master, and let me never hear a word more about him. None here care what becomes of him. If you do, act the nurse. If you do not, lock him up and leave him. Then she began to bother me, and I said I'd have enough plague with the tiresome thing. We each had our tasks, and hers was to wait on Linton. Mr. Heathcliff bid me leave that labor to her. How they managed together I can't tell. I fancy he fretted a great deal, and moaned his cell night and day, and she had precious little rest. One could guess by her white face and heavy eyes. She sometimes came into the kitchen, all wildered-like, and looked as if she would fain beg assistance. But I was not going to disobey the master. I never dare disobey him, Mrs. Dean, and though I thought it wrong that Kenneth should not be sent for, it was no concern of mine either to advise or complain, and I always refused to meddle. Once or twice, after we had gone to bed, I've happened to crack my door open again, and see her sitting crying on the stairs top, and then I've shut myself in quick, for fear of being moved to interfere. I did pity her then, I'm sure. Still, I didn't wish to lose my place, you know? At last, one night, she came boldly into my chamber, and frightened me out of my wits, saying, "Tell Mr. Heathcliff that his son is dying. I am sure he is this time. Get up instantly and tell him." Having uttered this speech, she vanished again. I lay a quarter of an hour listening and trembling. Nothing stirred. The house was quiet. "She's mistaken," I said to myself. "He's got over it. I needn't disturb them," and I began to doze. But my sleep was marred a second time by a sharp ringing of the bell, the only bell we have, put up on purpose for Linton, and the master called to me to see what was the matter, and informed them that he wouldn't have that noise repeated. I delivered Catherine's message. He cursed to himself, and in a few minutes came out with a lighted candle, and proceeded to their room. I followed. Mrs. Heathcliff was seated by the bedside, with her hands folded on her knees. Her father-in-law went up, held the light to Linton's face, looked at him, and touched him. Afterwards, he turned to him. "Now, Catherine," he said, "how do you feel?" She was dumb. "How do you feel, Catherine?" he repeated. "He is safe, and I am free," she answered. "I should feel well, but," she continued, with a bitterness she couldn't conceal, "you have left me so long to struggle against death alone, that I feel and see only death. I feel like death." And she looked like it, too. I gave her a little wine. Hareton and Joseph, who had been wakened by the ringing and the sound of feet, and heard our talk from outside, now entered. Joseph was fain, I believe, of the lad's removal. Hareton seemed a thought bothered, though he was more taken up with staring at Catherine than thinking of Linton. But the master bid him get off to bed again, and didn't want his help. He afterwards made Joseph remove the body to his chamber, and told me to return to mine, and Mrs. Heathcliff remained by herself. In the morning, he sent me to tell her she must come down to breakfast. She had undressed, and appeared going to sleep, and said she was ill, at which I hardly wondered. I informed Mr. Heathcliff, and he replied, "Well, let her be till after the funeral, and go up now and then to get her what is needful, and, as soon as she seems better, tell me." Cathy stayed upstairs a fortnight, according to Zillah, who visited her twice a day, and would have been rather more friendly, but her attempts at increasing kindness were proudly and promptly repelled. Heathcliff went up once, to show her Linton's will. He had bequeathed the whole of his, and what had been hers, movable property, to his father. The poor creature was threatened, or coaxed into that act, during her week's absence, when his uncle died. The lands, being a manor, he could not meddle with. However, Mr. Heathcliff has claimed, and kept them in his wife's right, and his also, I suppose legally. At any rate, Catherine, destitute of cash and friends, cannot disturb his possession. Nobody, said Zillah, ever approached her door, except that once, but I. And nobody asked anything about her. The first occasion of her coming down into the house was on a Sunday afternoon. She had cried out, when I carried up her dinner, that she couldn't bear any longer being in the cold, and I told her that the master was going to Thrushcross Grange and Earnshaw, and I needn't hinder her from descending. So, as soon as she heard Heathcliff's horse trot off, she made her appearance, donned in black, and her yellow curls combed back behind her ears as plain as a Quaker. She couldn't comb them out. Joseph and I generally go to chapel on Sundays. The kirk, you know, has no minister now, explained Mrs. Dean, and they call the Methodist or Baptist place. I can't say which it is. At Gibberton, a chapel. Joseph had gone, she continued, but I thought proper to bide at home. Young folks are always the better for an elder's overlooking, and Hareton, with all his bashfulness, isn't a model of nice behavior. I let him know that his cousin would very likely sit with us, and she had been always used to see the Sabbaths respected. So he had as good leave his guns and bits of indoors work alone, while she stayed. He colored up at the news, and cast his eyes over his hands and clothes. The train oil and gunpowder were shoved out of sight in a minute. I saw he meant to give her his company, and I guessed, by his way, he wanted to be presentable. So, laughing, as I durst not laugh when the master is by, I offered it to help him, if he would, and joked at his confusion. He grew sullen, and began to swear. Now, Mrs. Dean, Zillah went on, seeing me not pleased by her manner, you happen think your young lady too fine for Mr. Hareton, and happen you're right, but I own I should love well to bring her pride and a peg lower. And what will all her learning and her daintiness do her now? She's as poor as you or I. Poorer, I'll be bound. You're saving, and I'm doing my little all that road. Hareton allowed Zillah to give him her aid, and she flattered him into a good humor. So when Catherine came, half forgetting her formal insults, he tried to make himself agreeable by the housekeeper's account. Mrs. walked in, she said, as chill as an icicle and as high as a princess. I got up and offered her my seat in the armchair. No, she turned up her nose at my civility. Earnshaw rose, too, and bid her come to the settle and sit close by the fire. He was sure she was starved. I've been starved a month and more, she answered, resting on the word as scornful as she could. And she got a chair for herself and placed it at a distance from both of us. Having sat till she was warm, she began to look around and discovered a number of books on the dresser. She was instantly upon her feet again, stretching to reach them, but they were too high up. Her cousin, after watching her endeavors a while, at last summoned courage to help her. She held her frock, and he filled it with the first that came to hand. That was a great advance for the lad. She didn't thank him. Still, he felt gratified that she had accepted his assistance, and ventured to stand behind him as she examined them, and even to stoop and point out what struck his fancy in certain old pictures which they contained. Nor was he daunted by the saucy style in which she jerked the page from his finger. He contented himself with going a bit further back and looking at her instead of the book. She continued reading, or seeking for something to read. His attention became, by degrees, quite centered in the study of her thick, silky curls. Her face he couldn't see, and she couldn't see him, and perhaps not quite awake to what he did, but attracted like a child to a candle. At last, he proceeded from staring to touching. He put out his hand and stroked one curl, as gently as if it were a bird. He might have struck a knife into her neck. She started around in such a taking. "Get away this moment! How dare you touch me? Why are you stopping there?" She cried in a tone of disgust. "I can't endure you. I'll go upstairs. I'll go upstairs again if you come near me." Mr. Hareton recoiled, looking as foolish as he could do. He sat down in the settle very quiet, and she continued turning over her volumes another half hour. Finally, Earnshaw crossed over and whispered to me, "Will you ask her to read to us, Zillah? I'm stalled of doing naught, and I could like to hear her. Do not say I wanted it, but ask of your son." "Mr. Hareton wishes you would read to us, ma'am," I said immediately. "He'd take it very kind. He'd be much obliged." She frowned, and, looking up, answered, "Mr. Hareton and the whole set of you will be good enough to understand that I reject any pretense of kindness you have the hypocrisy to offer. I despise you, and will have nothing to say to any of you. When I would have given my life for one kind word, even to see one of your faces, you all kept off. But I won't complain to you. I'm driven down here by the cold, not either to amuse you or enjoy your society." "What that I could have done," began Earnshaw. "How was I to blame?" "Oh, you are an exception," answered Mrs. Heathcliff. "I never missed such a concern as you." "But I offered more than once, and asked," he said, kindling up at her pertness. "I asked Mr. Heathcliff to let me wake for you." "Be silent! I'll go out of doors, or anywhere, rather than have your disagreeable voice in my ear," said my lady. Hareton muttered she might go to hell for him, and, unslinging his gun, restrained himself from his Sunday occupations no longer. He talked now freely enough, and she presently saw fit to retreat to her solitude. But the frost had set in, and in spite of her pride, she was forced to condescend to our company more and more. However, I took care that there should be no further scorning at my good nature, ever since. I've been as stiff as herself, and she has no lover or liker among us, and she does not deserve one, for let them say the least word to her, and she'll curl back without respect of any one. She'll snap at the master himself, and as good as dares him to thrash her. The more hurt she gets, the more venomous she grows. At first, on hearing this account from Zillah, I determined to leave my situation, take a cottage, and get Catherine to come and live with me, but Mr. Heathcliff would as soon permit that as he would set up Hareton in an independent house, and I can see no remedy at present unless she could marry again, and that scheme it does not come within my province to arrange. Thus ended Mrs. Dean's story. Notwithstanding the doctor's prophecy, I am rapidly recovering strength, and though it be only the second week in January, I propose getting out on horseback in a day or two, and riding over to Wuthering Heights, to inform my landlord that I shall spend the next 6 months in London, and, if he likes, he may look out for another tenant to take the place after October. I would not pass another winter here for much. And that brings us to the end of chapter 30. That brings us to the present day. We've seen sort of how the cast of characters that we saw at the beginning reached where they are, how they became such withered, bitter husks, a lot of them. And it really seems that Catherine is made out to be almost the same position that Heathcliff was in. Unwanted, brought in the house, unliked, across the board, bitter and cruel, when she's been the victim most of her life. Not entirely blameless. A lot of this was brought on by her own naive, overly kind nature. She got it in her head to fix Linton, and that was kind of the doom that came down to it. But yeah, it really boils down to Earnshaw Sr. being terrible to Heathcliff way forever ago. And then it all just spiraled out of control. So that, and it even further back, the kindness that Catherine's father, the Catherine the Elder, had to take in Heathcliff off the street when he was out on business. That one good turn just destroyed two families. And you hate to see it, but like one good turn just absolutely destroys everything that it touches. So yeah, it's wild. But okay, that's been quite a lot all at once. So let's go ahead and take a short break. I'll update my drink and catch my breath for a little bit, and then we'll push on after we return. We're about there's about 10% left, so we'll get pretty far tonight. There won't be a whole lot left for Sunday. So we'll see as we get toward the end of time how much is left, and we might push long just so we can power through, or we'll leave and have a short reading tomorrow so we can discuss more. We'll take a vibe check as we get closer to time. But for now, let's take a quick break for a couple minutes. I'll top up my drink, stretch a little bit, get some breath, and we'll be back in a little while. Thanks, guys. Okay, we are back. Let me update my drink here. I made a fresh cup of tea. That should get us through the rest of the night. Alright, well, let's get back into the book then. We are not a lot. Let me actually get a count for chapters that are left here. So there are only 4 chapters left for us to get through. And we'll probably get through at least 2 of them yet tonight. And that'll probably leave us with a fair bit left for tomorrow for a bit to read and then some time to talk about the book and just kind of gather our thoughts. So I think that'll be our plan. So let's go ahead and get through 2 more chapters tonight and we'll go from there. Alright, so chapter 31. Yesterday was bright, calm and frosty. I went to the Heights as I proposed. My housekeeper entreated me to bear a little note from her to her young lady, and I did not refuse, for the worthy woman was not conscious of anything odd in her request. The front door stood open, but the jealous gate was fastened. As at my last visit, I knocked, and invoked Earnshaw from among the garden beds. He unchained it, and I entered. The fellow is as handsome a rustic as never be seen. I took particular notice of him this time, but then he does his best, apparently, to make the least of his advantages. I asked if Mr. Heathcliff were at home. He answered, no, but he would be in at dinner time. It was 11 o'clock, and I announced my intention of going in and waiting for him, at which he immediately flung down his tools and accompanied me, in the office of watchdog, not as a substitute for the host. We entered together. Catherine was there, making herself useful in preparing some vegetables for the approaching meal. She looked more sulky and less spirited than when I had seen her first. She hardly raised her eyes to notice me, and continued her employment with the same disregard to common forms of politeness as before, never returning my bow and good morning by the slightest acknowledgment. She does not seem so amiable, I thought, as Mrs. Dean would persuade me to believe. She's a beauty, it is true, but not an angel. Earnshaw surlily bid her remove her things to the kitchen. Remove them yourself, she said, pushing them from her as soon as she had done, and retiring to a stool by the window, where she began to carve figures of birds and beasts out of the turnip parings in her lap. I approached her, pretending to desire a view of the garden, and as I fancied, adroitly dropped Mrs. Dean's note onto her knee, unnoticed by Hareton. But she asked aloud, "What is that?" and chucked it off. "A letter from your old acquaintance, the housekeeper at the Grange," I answered, annoyed at her exposing my kind deed, and fearful lest it should be imagined a missive of my own. She would gladly have gathered it up at this information, but Hareton beat her. He seized and put it in his waistcoat, saying Mr. Heathcliff should look at it first. Thereat, Catherine silently turned her face from us, and, very stealthily, drew out her pocket handkerchief and applied it to her eyes, and her cousin, after struggling a while to keep down his softer feelings, pulled out the letter and flung it on the floor beside her, as ungraciously as he could. Catherine caught and perused it eagerly. Then she put a few questions to me concerning the inmates, rational and irrational, of her former home, and gazing towards the hills, murmured in soliloquy, "I should like to be riding Minnie down there. I should like to be climbing up there. Oh, I'm tired. I'm stalled. Hareton!" And she leant her pretty head back against the sill, with half a yawn and half a sigh, and lapsed into an aspect of abstracted sadness, neither caring nor knowing whether we remarked her. "Mrs. Heathcliff," I said, after sitting some time mute, "you are not aware that I am an acquaintance of yours, so intimate that I think it strange you won't come and speak to me. My housekeeper never wearies of talking about and praising you, and she'll be greatly disappointed if I return with no news of or from you, except that you've received her letter and said nothing." She appeared to wonder at this speech, and asked, "Does Ellen like you?" "Yes, very well," I replied, hesitatingly. "You must tell her," she continued, "that I would answer her letter, but I have no materials for writing, not even a book from which I might tear a leaf." "No books!" I exclaimed. "How do you contrive to live here without them? If I may take the liberty to inquire, though provided with a large library, I am frequently very dull at the Grange. Take my books away, and I should be desperate." "I was always reading when I had them," said Catherine, "and Mr. Heathcliff never reads, so he took it into his head to destroy my books. I have not had a glimpse of one for weeks. Only once I searched through Joseph's store of theology, to his great irritation, and once, Hareton, I came upon a secret stock in your room, some Latin and Greek, and some tales and poetry, all old friends. I brought the last here, and you gathered them, as a magpie gathers silver spoons, for the mere love of stealing. They are of no use to you, or else you concealed them in the bad spirit that, as you cannot enjoy them, nobody else shall. Perhaps your envy counseled Mr. Heathcliff to rob me of my treasures, but I have most of them written on my brain, and printed in my heart, and you cannot deprive me of those." Earnshaw blushed crimson when his cousin made this revelation of his private literary accumulations, and stammered an indignant denial of her accusations. "Mr. Hareton is desirous of increasing his amount of knowledge," I said, coming to his rescue. "He is not envious, but emulous of your attainments. He'll be a clever scholar in a few years." "And he wants me to sink into a dunce meantime," answered Catherine. "Yes, I hear him trying to spell and read to himself, and pretty blunders he makes. I wish you would repeat Chevy Chase as you did yesterday. It was extremely funny. I heard you, and I heard you turning over the dictionary to seek out the hard words, and then cursing because you couldn't read their explanations." The young man evidently thought it too bad that he should be laughed at for his ignorance, and then laughed at for trying to remove it. I had a similar notion, and remembering Mrs. Dean's anecdote of his first attempt at enlightening the darkness in which he had been reared, I observed, "But, Mrs. Heathcliff, we have each had a commencement, and each stumbled and tottered on the threshold. Had our teachers scorned instead of aiding us, we should stumble and totter yet." "Oh," she replied, "I don't wish to limit his acquirements. Still, he has no right to appropriate what is mine, and make it ridiculous to me with his vile mistakes and mispronunciations. Those books, both prose and verse, are consecrated to me by other associations, and I hate to have them debased and profaned in his mouth." Besides, of all, he has selected my favorite pieces that I love the most to repeat, as if out of deliberate malice. Hareton's chest heaved in silence a minute. He labored under a severe sense of mortification and wrath, which it is no easy task to suppress. I rose, and, from a gentlemanly idea of relieving his embarrassment, took up my station in the doorway, surveying the external prospect as I stood. He followed my example, and left the room, but presently reappeared, bearing a half-a-dozen volumes in his hands, which he threw into Catherine's lap, exclaiming, "Take them! I never want to hear or read or think of them again." "I won't have them now," she answered. "I shall connect them with you, and hate them." She opened one that had obviously been often turned over, and read a portion in the drawling tone of a beginner, then laughed and threw it from her. "And listen," she continued, provokingly, commencing a verse of an old ballad in the same fashion. But his self-love would endure no further torment. I heard, and not altogether disapprovingly, a manual check given to her saucy tongue. The little wretch had done her utmost to hurt her cousin's sensitive, though uncultivated feelings, and a physical argument was the only mode he had of balancing the account, and repaying its effect on the inflictor. He afterwards gathered the books and hurled them on the fire. I read in his countenance what anguish it was to offer that sacrifice to spleen. I fancied that as they consumed, he recalled the pleasure they had already imparted, and the triumph and ever-increasing pleasure he had anticipated from them, and I fancied I guessed the incitement to his secret studies also. He had been content with daily labor and rough animal enjoyments, till Catherine crossed his path. Shame at her scorn, and hope of her approval, were his first prompters to higher pursuits, and instead of guarding him from one and winning him to the other, his endeavors to raise himself had produced just the contrary result. "Yes, that's all the good that such a brute as you can get from them," cried Catherine, sucking her damaged lip, and watching the conflagration with indignant eyes. "You'd better hold your tongue now," he answered fiercely, and his agitation precluded further speech. He advanced hastily to the entrance, where I made way for him to pass, but ere he had crossed the doorstones, Mr. Heathcliff, coming up the causeway, encountered him, and laying hold of his shoulder, asked, "What's to do now, my lad?" Not," he said, and broke away to enjoy his grief and anger in solitude. Heathcliff gazed after him, and sighed. "It will be odd if I thwart myself," he muttered, unconscious that I was behind him. "But when I look for his father in his face, I find her every day more. How the devil is he so like? I can hardly bear to see him." He bent his eyes to the ground, and walked moodily in. There was a restless, anxious expression in his countenance I had never remarked there before, and he looked sparer in person. His daughter-in-law, on perceiving him through the window, immediately escaped to the kitchen, so that I remained alone. "I'm glad to see you out of doors again, Mr. Lockwood," he said, in reply to my greeting, "from selfish motives partly. I don't think I could readily supply your loss in this desolation. I've wondered more than once what brought you here." "An idle whim, I fear, sir," was my answer, "or else an idle whim is going to spirit me away. I shall set out for London next week, and I must give you warning that I feel no disposition to retain Thrushcross Grange beyond the 12 months I agreed to rent it. I believe I shall not live there any more." "Oh, indeed, you're tired of being banished from the world, are you?" he said. "But if you be coming to plead off paying for a place you won't occupy, your journey is useless. I never relent in exacting my due from anyone." "I'm coming to plead off nothing about it," I exclaimed, considerably irritated. "Should you wish it, I'll settle with you now," and I drew my notebook from my pocket. No, he replied coolly. "You'll leave sufficient behind to cover your debts, if you fail to return. I'm not in such a hurry. Sit down and take your dinner with us. A guest that is safe from repeating his visit can generally be made welcome. Catherine, bring the things in. Where are you?" Catherine reappeared, bearing a tray of knives and forks. "You may get your dinner with Joseph," muttered Heathcliff aside, "and remain in the kitchen till he is gone." She obeyed his directions, very punctually. Perhaps she had no temptation to transgress. Living among clowns and misanthropists, she probably cannot appreciate a better class of people than she meets them. With Mr. Heathcliff grim and saturnine on the one hand, and Hareton absolutely dumb on the other, I made a somewhat cheerless meal, and bade adieu early. I would have departed by the back way, to get a last glimpse of Catherine and annoy old Joseph, but Hareton received orders to lead up my horse, and my host himself escorted me to the door, so I could not fulfill my wish. How dreary life gets over in that house, I reflected, while riding down the road. What a realization of something more romantic than a fairy tale it would have been for Mrs. Linton Heathcliff, had she and I struck up an attachment, as her good nurse desired, and migrated together into the stirring atmosphere of the town. And that brings us to the end of chapter 31. So it does seem that there's not going to be any salvation from Lockwood. And really, could you really wish it on him? That would be inflicting untold pain on him, because everyone involved can really only lash out and hurt each other at this point. Alright, let's get through one more chapter tonight. So we've got chapter 32. 1802. This September, I was invited to devastate the moors of a friend in the north, and on my journey to his abode, I unexpectedly came within 15 miles of Gimmerton. The ostler at a roadside public house was holding a pail of water to refresh my horses, when a cart of very green oats, newly reaped, passed by, and he remarked, "Yon's for Gimmerton, nah? They're all as 3 wick after old folk with their harvest." Gimmerton, I repeated. My residence in that locality had already grown dim and dreamy. "Ah, I know. How far is it from this?" "Happened 14 mile over the hills, and a rough road," he answered. A sudden impulse seized me to visit Thrushcross Grange. It was scarcely noon, and I conceived that I might as well pass the night under my own roof as in an inn. Besides, I could spare a day easily to arrange matters with my landlord, and thus save myself the trouble of invading the neighborhood again. Having rested a while, I directed my servant to inquire the way to the village, and, with great fatigue to our beasts, we managed the distance in some 3 hours. I left him there, and proceeded down the valley alone. The grey church looked greyer, and the lonely churchyard lonelier. I distinguished a moor-sheep cropping the short turf on the graves. It was sweet, warm weather, too warm for traveling, but the heat did not hinder me from enjoying the delightful scenery above and below. Had I seen it nearer August, I'm sure it would have tempted me to waste a month among its solitudes. In winter, nothing more dreary. In summer, nothing more divine than those glens shut in by hills, and those bluff, bold swells of heath. I reached the Grange before sunset, and knocked for admittance, but the family had retreated into the back premises. I judged, by one thin, blue wreath curling from the kitchen chimney, that they did not hear. I rode into the court, under the porch. A girl of 9 or 10, knitting, and an old woman reclined on the house steps, smoking a meditative pipe. "Is Mrs. Dean within?" I demanded of the dame. "Mistress Dean? Nay," she answered. "She doesn't bide here. She was up at the Heights." "Are you the housekeeper, then?" I continued. "Yep, I'll keep the house," she replied. "Well, I'm Mr. Lockwood, the master. Are there any rooms to lodge me in, I wonder? I wish to stay all night." "To Meister!" she cried in astonishment. "Wait, whoever knew y'all were coming? Y'all should have sent word. There's nother dry nor mensful about the place. Not there isn't." Been a while since we had that accent. She threw down her pipe and bustled in. The girl followed. I entered too, soon perceiving that her report was true, and, moreover, that I had almost upset her wits by my unwelcome apparition. I bade her to be composed. I would go out for a walk, and meantime she must try to prepare a corner of a sitting room for me to sup in, and a bedroom to sleep in. No sweeping and dusting, only good fire and dry sheets were necessary. She seemed willing to do her best, though she thrust the hearth-brush into the grates in mistake for the poker, and malappropriated several other articles of her craft, but I retired, confiding in her energy, for a resting place against my return. Wuthering Heights was the goal of my proposed excursion, and an afterthought brought me back, when I had quitted the court. "All well at the Heights?" I inquired of the woman. "Yeah, for aught you know," she answered, scurrying away with a pan of hot cinders. I would have asked why Mrs. Dean had deserted the Grange, but it was impossible to delay her at such a crisis, so I turned away and made my exit, rambling leisurely along, with the glow of a sinking sun behind, and the mild glory of a rising moon in front, one fading and the other brightening as I quitted the park, and climbed the stony by-road branching off to Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Before I arrived in sight of it, all that remained of day was a beamless amber light along the west, but I could see every pebble on the path, and every blade of grass, by that splendid moon. I had neither to climb the gate nor to knock. It yielded to my hand. That is an improvement, I thought, and I noticed another, by the aid of my nostrils. A fragrance of stocks and wallflowers wafted on the air from amongst the homely fruit trees. Both doors and lattices were open, and yet, as is usually the case in a coal district, a fine red fire illumined the chimney. The comfort which the eye derives from it renders the extra heat endurable, but the house of Wuthering Heights is so large that the inmates have plenty of space for withdrawing out of its influence, and accordingly, what inmates there were had stationed themselves not far from one of the windows. I could both see them and hear them talk before I entered. I looked and listened in consequence, being moved thereto by a mingled sense of curiosity and envy that grew as I lingered. "Contrary," said a voice as sweet as a silver bell. "That, for the third time, you dunce. I'm not going to tell you again. Recollect, or I'll pull your hair." "Contrary, then," answered another in deep but softened tones. "And now, kiss me for minding so well. No, read it over first correctly, without a single mistake." The male speaker began to read. He was a young man, respectably dressed and seated at a table, having a book before him. His handsome features glowed with pleasure, and his eyes kept impatiently wandering from the page to a small white hand over his shoulder, which recalled him by a smart slap on the cheek, whenever its owner detected such signs of inattention. Its owner stood behind, her light, shining ringlets blending at intervals with his brown locks, as she bent to superintend his studies, and her face, it was lucky he could not see her face, or he would never have been so steady. I could, and I bit my lip in spite, at having thrown away the chance I might have had of doing something besides staring at its smiting beauty. The task was done, not free from further blunders, but the pupil claimed a reward, and received at least 5 kisses, which, however, he generously returned. Then they came to the door, and from their conversation I judged they were about to issue out and have a walk on the moors. I supposed I should be condemned in Hareton Earnshaw's heart, if not by his mouth, to the lowest pit in the infernal regions if I showed my unfortunate person in his neighborhood then. And, feeling very mean and malignant, I skulked round to seek refuge in the kitchen. There was unobstructed admittance on that side also, and at the door sat my old friend Nellie Dean, sewing and singing a song, which was often interrupted from within by harsh words of scorn and intolerance, uttered in far from musical accents. "I'd rather be off if I have 'em swearing in my lungs from morn to neat, nor hearken ye has iver," said the tenant of the kitchen, in answer to an unheard speech of Nellie's. "It's a blazing shame that I cannot open the blessed book, but ye set up them glories to Satan and all the fleesome wickedness that ever born into the world. Oh, you writing out and choose another, and that poor lad'll be lost between you. Ah, poor lad," he added, with a groan. "He's witched, I'm sartin on't. Oh, Lord, judge 'em, for there's neither law nor justice among rulers." "No, or we should be sitting in flaming faggots, I suppose," retorted the singer. "But wisht, old man, and read your Bible like a Christian, and never mind me. This is Fairy Annie's Wedding, a bonny tune. It goes to a dance." Mrs. Dean was about to recommence when I advanced, and, recognizing me directly, she jumped to her feet, crying, "Why, bless you, Mr. Lockwood, how could you think of returning in this way? All shut up at Thrushcross Grange. You should have given us notice." "I have arranged to be accommodated there, for as long as I shall stay," I answered. "I depart again tomorrow. And how were you transplanted here, Mrs. Dean? Tell me that." "Zillah left, and Mr. Heathcliff wished me to come, soon after you went to London, and stay till you returned. But step in, pray. Have you walked from Gimmerton this evening?" "From the Grange," I replied, "and while they make me lodging room there, I want to finish my business with your master, because I don't think of having another opportunity in a hurry." "What business, sir?" said Nellie, conducting me into the house. "He's gone out at present, and won't return soon." "About the rent," I answered. "Oh, then it is with Mrs. Heathcliff you must settle," she observed, "or rather with me. She has not learnt to manage her affairs yet, and I act for her. There is nobody else." I looked surprised. "Ah, you have not heard of Heathcliff's death, I see," she continued. "Heathcliff dead!" I exclaimed, astonished. "How long ago?" 3 months since. But sit down, and let me take your hat, and I'll tell you all about it. Stop, you have had nothing to eat, have you? I want nothing. I have ordered supper at home, and you sit down too. I never dreamt of his dying. Let me hear how it came to pass. You say you don't expect them back for some time, the young people? No, I have to scold them every evening for their late rambles, but they don't care for me. At least have a drink of our old ale. It will do you good. You seem weary. She hastened to fetch it before I could refuse, and I heard Joseph asking whether it weren't a crying scandal that she should have followers at her time of life. And then, to get them jocks out to Meister's cellar, he fair shamed bide still and see it. She did not stay to retaliate, but re-entered in a minute, bearing a reaming silver pint, whose contents I lauded with becoming earnestness. And afterwards she furnished me with the sequel of Heathcliff's history, and had a queer end, as she expressed it. I was summoned to Wuthering Heights, within a fortnight of your leaving us, she said, and I obeyed joyfully, for Catherine's sake. My first interview with her grieved and shocked me. She had altered so much since our separation. Mr. Heathcliff did not explain his reasons for taking a new mind about my coming here. He only told me he wanted me, and he was tired of seeing Catherine. I must make the little parlor my sitting room, and keep her with me. It was enough if he were obliged to see her once or twice a day. She seemed pleased at this arrangement, and by degrees I smuggled over a great number of books and other articles that had formed her amusement at the Grange, and flattered myself we should get on in tolerable comfort. The delusion did not last long. Catherine commented, at first, in a brief space, grew irritable and restless. For one thing, she was forbidden to move out of the garden, and it fretted her sadly to be confined to its narrow bounds as spring drew on. For another, in following the house, I was forced to quit her frequently, and she complained of loneliness. She preferred quarreling with Joseph in the kitchen to sitting at peace in her solitude. I did not mind her skirmishes, but Hareton was often obliged to seek the kitchen also, when the master wanted to have the house to himself. And though in the beginning she either left it at his approach or quietly joined in my occupations, and shunned remarking or addressing him, and though he was always as sullen and silent as possible, after a while she changed her behavior, and became incapable of letting him alone, talking at him, commenting on his stupidity and idleness, expressing her wonder how he could endure the life he lived, and how he could sit a whole evening staring into the fire and dozing. "He's just like a dog, is he not, Ellen?" she once observed, "or a cart horse. He does his work, eats his food, and sleeps eternally. What a blank, dreary mind he must have. Do you ever dream, Hareton? And if you do, what is it about? But you can't speak to me." Then she looked at him, and he would neither open his mouth nor look again. "He's, perhaps, dreaming now," she continued. He twitched his shoulder as Juno twitches hers. "Ask him, Ellen." "Mr. Hareton will ask the master to send you upstairs, if you don't behave," I said. He had not only twitched his shoulder, but clenched his fist, as if tempted to use it. "I know why Hareton never speaks when I am in the kitchen," she exclaimed, on another occasion. "He is afraid I shall laugh at him. Ellen, what do you think? He began to teach himself to read once, and because I laughed, he burned his books, and dropped it. Was he not a fool?" Were not you naughty?" I said. "Answer me that." "Perhaps I was," she went on, "but I did not expect him to be so silly. Hareton, if I give you a book, would you take it now? I'll try." She placed one she had been perusing on his hand. He flung it off and muttered, if she did not give over, he would break her neck. "Well, I shall put it here," she said, "in the table drawer, and I'm going to bed." Then she whispered me to watch whether he touched it, and departed. But he would not come near it, and so I informed her in the morning, to her great disappointment. I saw she was sorry for his persevering sulkiness and indolence. Her conscience reproved her for frightening him off improving himself, but she had done it effectually. But her ingenuity was at work to remedy the injury. While I ironed, or pursued other such stationary employments as I could not well do in the parlor, she would bring some pleasant volume and read it aloud to me. When Hareton was there, she generally paused in an interesting part, and left the book lying about. That she did repeatedly, but he was as obstinate as a mule, and instead of snatching at her bait, in wet weather he took to smoking with Joseph, as they did like automatons, one on each side of the fire, the elder happily too deaf to understand her wicked nonsense, as he would have called it. the younger doing his best to seem to disregard it. On fine evenings, the latter followed his shooting expeditions, and Catherine yawned and sighed, and teased me to talk to her, and ran off into the court or garden the moment I began, and, as a last resource, cried, and said she was tired of living, her life was useless. Mr. Heathcliff, who grew more and more disinclined to society, had almost banished Earnshaw from his apartment, owing to an incident at the commencement of March. He became, for some days, a fixture in the kitchen. His gun burst while out on the hills by himself, a splinter cut his arm, and he lost a good deal of blood before he could reach home. The consequence was that, perforce, he was condemned to the fireside and tranquillity till he made it up again. It suited Catherine to have him there, at any rate. It made her hate her room upstairs more than ever, and she would compel me to find out business below, that she might accompany me. On Easter Monday, Joseph went to Gimmerton Fair with some cattle, and in the afternoon I was busy getting up linen in the kitchen. Earnshaw sat, morose as usual, at the chimney corner, and my little mistress was beguiling an idle hour, while drawing pictures on the window panes, varying her amusement by smothered bursts of songs, and whispered ejaculations, and quick glances of annoyance, and impatience in the direction of her cousin, who steadfastly smoked and looked into the grate. At a notice that I could do with her no longer intercepting my light, she removed to the hearthstone. I bestowed little attention on her proceedings, but presently I heard her begin. "I've found out, Hareton, that I'm glad, that I should like you to be my cousin now, if you had not grown so cross to me and so rough." Hareton returned no answer. Hareton, do you hear?" she continued. "Get off with ye," he growled with uncompromising gruffness. "Let me take that pipe," she said, cautiously advancing her hand and abstracting it from his mouth. Before he could attempt to recover it, it was broken, and behind the fire. He swore at her and seized another. "Stop," she cried. "You must listen to me first, and I can't speak with those clouds are floating in my face." "Will you go to the devil," he exclaimed ferociously, "and let me be?" "No," she persisted, "I won't. I can't tell what to do to make you talk to me, and you are determined not to understand. When I call you stupid, I don't mean anything. I don't mean that I despise you. Come, you shall take notice of me. Hareton, you are my cousin, and you shall own me. I shan't have naught to do with you and your mucky pride, and your damn mocking tricks," he answered. "I'll go to hell, body and soul, before I look sideways after you again. Side out to gate, now this minute." Catherine frowned, and retreated to the window seat, chewing her lip, endeavoring, by humming an eccentric tune, to conceal a growing tendency to sob. "You should be friends with your cousin, Mr. Hareton," I interrupted. "Since she repents of her sauciness, it would do you a great deal of good. It would make you another man to have her for a companion." "A companion!" he cried, "when she hates me, and does not think me fit to wipe her shoon. Nay, if it made me a king, I'd not be scorned for keeping her goodwill any more." "It is not I who hate you, it is you who hate me," wept Cathy, no longer disguising her trouble. "You hate me as much as Mr. Heathcliff does, and more." "You're a damned liar," began Earnshaw. "Why have I made him angry? By taking your part, then, 100 times? And that, when you sneered and despised at me, and go on plaguing me, and I'll step in yonder and say you worried me out of the kitchen." "I didn't know you took my part," she answered, drying her eyes, "and I was miserable and bitter at everybody. But now I thank you, and beg you to forgive me. What can I do besides?" She returned to the hearth, and frankly extended her hand. He blackened and scowled like a thundercloud, and kept his fists resolutely clenched, and his gaze fixed on the ground. Catherine, by instinct, must have divined it was obdurate perversity, and not dislike, that prompted this dogged conduct. For after remaining an instant undecided, she stooped and impressed on his cheek a gentle kiss. The little rogue thought I had not seen her, and drawing back, she took her former station by the window, quite demurely. I shook my head reprovingly, and then she blushed and whispered, "Well, what should I have done, Helen? He wouldn't shake hands, and he wouldn't look. I must show him some way that I like him, that I want to be friends." Whether the kiss convinced Hareton, I cannot tell. He was very careful, for some minutes, that his face should not be seen, and when he did raise it, he was sadly puzzled where to turn his eyes. Catherine employed herself in wrapping a handsome book neatly in white paper, and having tied it with a bit of ribbon, and addressed it to Mr. Hareton Earnshaw, she desired me to be her ambassadress, and convey the present to its destined recipient. And tell him, if he'll take it, I'll come and teach him to read it right, she said, and if he refuse it, I'll go upstairs and never tease him again. I carried it and repeated the message, anxiously watched by my employer. Hareton would not open his fingers, so I laid it on his knee. He did not strike it off either. I returned to my work. Catherine leaned her head and arms on the table till she heard the slight rustle of the covering being removed. Then she stole away and quietly seated herself beside her cousin. He trembled, and his face glowed. All his rudeness and all his surly harshness had deserted him. He could not summon courage, at first, to utter a syllable in reply to her questioning look and her murmured petition. Say you forgive me, Hareton. Do. You can make me so happy by speaking that little word. He muttered something inaudible. And you'll be my friend? Added Catherine, interrogatively. Nay, you'll be ashamed of me every day of your life, he answered. And the more ashamed, the more you know me, and I cannot bide it. Say you won't be my friend, she said, smiling as sweet as honey, and creeping close up. I overheard no further distinguishable talk, but on looking round again, I perceived two such radiant countenances bent over the page of the accepted book, that I did not doubt the treaty had been ratified on both sides, and the enemies were, thenceforth, sworn allies. The work they studied was full of costly pictures, and those in their position had charm enough to keep them unmoved till Joseph came home. He, poor man, was perfectly aghast at the spectacle of Catherine seated on the same bench with Hareton Earnshaw, leaning her hand on his shoulder, and confounded at his favourite's endurance of her proximity. It affected him too deeply to allow an observation on the subject that night. His emotion was only revealed by the immense sighs he drew, as he solemnly spread his large Bible on the table and overlaid it with dirty banknotes from his pocketbook to produce the produce of the day's transactions. At length he summoned Hareton from his seat. Take these into Meister, lad, he said, and bide there. I's gang up on my own rom. This hoile's rather neither mensful nor seemly for us. We must side out and search another. Come, Catherine, I said, we must side out too. I've done my ironing. Are you ready to go? It's not 8 o'clock, she answered, rising unwillingly. Hareton, I'll leave this book upon the chimney, please, and I'll bring some more tomorrow. Only books that y'all leave I shall take into the house, said Joseph, and it'll be Mitch if you find 'em again. So you may please yourself. Cathy threatened that his library should pay for hers, and smiling as she passed Hareton, went singing upstairs, lighter of heart, I venture to say, than ever she had been under that roof before, except, perhaps, during her earliest visits to Linton. The intimacy thus commenced grew rapidly, though it encountered temporary interruptions. Earnshaw was not to be civilized with a wish, and my young lady was no philosopher and no paragon of patience, but both their minds tending to the same point, one loving and desiring to esteem, and the other loving and desiring to be esteemed, they contrived in the end to reach it. You see, Mr. Lockwood, it was easy enough to win Mrs. Heathcliff's heart, but now I'm glad you did not try. The crown of all my wishes will be the union of those two. I shall envy no one on their wedding day. There won't be a happier woman than myself in England. And that brings us to the end of chapter 32, which is a pretty dramatic shift in tone. We find that Heathcliff has died in the interim since Lockwood left, not even a year, and Cathy and Hareton have mended bridges and are on the way to setting up a life of their own. So there's, things move very quickly, I'm sure. So there's just a couple chapters left, and I do want to leave some for tomorrow. So let's see, because there are 2 chapters remaining, so we'll end there. But yeah, so I was shocked at the turn there. It very well could have ended when they caught up to the current and Lockwood said he was going to be off. That could have been an ending right there. So the fact that it continued on and we see, yeah, I know, I'm almost free from accents. Until the next book, I'm sure I'll pick one randomly that will have some torture that is beyond even this, I'm sure. Or we'll get to French again. There's always something. But yeah, this one's been it's been interesting so far. As I as I've mentioned before, it's like watching a train wreck. You can't look away. It's horrible and terrible, but you need to see how it wraps up. Um, and now we're seeing a bit of a glimmer of hope. There things maybe are not all bad, or they may return full circle, and there will be peace again on Wuthering Heights, um, as it seems there is. Um, but there's the last couple weeks of interim that we were left unknown. The time from when they started to do well and how Heathcliff finally met his end, because we just know that he's gone. We're not entirely sure how, but we'll find out tomorrow. We will definitely finish this book tomorrow, and we'll have time enough to discuss things. We may finish a little early tomorrow. Probably not crazy early. We do still have the 2 chapters to get through and have some time to chat, but we'll probably finish relatively early and have a chance to discuss the book and air out our thoughts beyond what we've already had. Try and dig into things and see if we can determine who was really at fault, where things started, where they went wrong, horribly wrong, where anywhere they could have been salvaged or saved, if anyone had been even remotely sensible. But we'll save that for tomorrow's discussion after we finish the last of the book. So let's go ahead and wrap up here tonight. I thank everyone for joining me, and I'll see you again tomorrow where we finish Wuthering Heights. Have a great night, everyone.